So first up, we have Bhante Akaliko Bhikkhu, who is a queer monk in the Theravada forest tradition. Bhante Akaliko is the founder of Rainbodhi LGBTQIA Buddhist Community in Sydney. He's also the Buddhist chaplain at Western Sydney University and sits on the board of directors at the Buddhist Council of New South Wales. He currently resides with his long-term teacher, Bhante Sujato, at the monastery at the end of the world. When you're ready, Bhante Akaliko.
Thank you so much, Sujit, and thank you for the acknowledgement of country. Tonight, I'm coming to you from Baramadagal lands in Western Sydney. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for organising it. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers too. So I'm also here tonight representing Rainbodhi LGBTQIA+ Buddhist community. This is a community I founded last year in response to the damaging religious discrimination bill that was being considered by the federal parliament. So Rainbodhi is a spiritual friendship and advocacy group, and we welcome everyone, regardless of religion, or regardless of no religion, regardless of race, cultural tradition, whatever. And this reflects, I suppose, a very Buddhist idea of love, compassion, and happiness for other beings. So this is something that also is at the base of the ethical framework of Buddhism. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual ethics, and to understand that we need to go way back in time, 2,600 years ago, to the age of the Buddha back in India. And we can understand that the cultural landscape of the time, including sexuality and gender, was very different from what we have in Western society like Australia today, or in other places around the world. So it's important for us to understand the cultural context of Buddhism, where Buddhism grew up, so that we can understand the kind of sexual ethics that the Buddha formulated and talked about. So we're very fortunate actually in Buddhism that this world was recorded in detail by the monks and nuns of the time and have been passed down to us for generations. So we know, for example, that it was a very gender diverse age. There was different sexualities. There's some things that we don't really understand about gender or sexuality. It's hard for us to map our modern ideas onto those ideas from the past, but we know that we were there, and of course we were. You know, we've always been around, and it's something that's very easy to forget. But we also learn about the sexual world of Buddhism at the time of the Buddha, which was incredibly diverse, colourful, and sometimes quite bizarre. We know that it was quite a sex-positive culture. We know that there was no taboos around casual sex, there was polygamy, there was group sex, there was sex workers, there was groups of people who were eunuchs, and there was all sorts of kinds of sexuality represented in our texts, as well as some rather unsavory things like abuse, bestiality, like rape, and even necrophilia. So this is the kind of cultural background that the Buddha was living in at the time. And when it came to talking about sexual ethics, these kind of issues probably played a large role in his thinking. So in Buddhism, there's sexual ethics appearing in two very particular parts of the Buddhist path. First part is called right action. So right action contains three different categories. One is sexual misconduct, and the other two are not killing and not stealing. And another area that sexual ethics appears is in the 5 precepts, which are 5 not rules, but encouragements that we're supposed to abide by as Buddhists. So these right actions, not killing, not stealing, and sexual misconduct, this shows perhaps the seriousness with which the Buddha looked at sexual ethics. And this is important because it wasn't something that was unknown. It wasn't something that was new. It was something that was culturally appropriate at the time. So all of these things rely upon that golden rule: do to others as you would have them do to you. And when we look at sexual misconduct, which I'll get to in a second, there's two basic things that underpin these ideas, and that is the idea of harm and the idea of consent. So killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, these are all things that cause harm to others. And these are all things that are done without consent. So sexual misconduct in Buddhism is essentially adultery, cheating. This is the main way that it's framed and the main way that it's come down to us today. There's certain other categories as well of sexual misconduct, such as sexual misconduct with someone who is already betrothed, already engaged to be married, sexual misconduct with people who are unable to consent, those people who are protected by nature, perhaps people who are mentally impaired. Anyone who is under the protection of their guardians, parents and family is considered a no-go zone, as is anyone who is already married or partnered. And the last category is any activity which will be punishable. So this again reflects that social concern. So just because it's punishable doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. And I say this coming from the point of view of a gay man who grew up in a culture where my sexuality was in fact illegal for some part of my youth. So in times where there's this kind of iniquitous legal framework, which applies to many countries around the world today, we can fall back on those other aspects that I mentioned already, the idea of harm, the idea of consent. So for sexual misconduct, this is anything that causes harm, anything done without consent. So what that means is that a lot of that sexual activity that we have is not sexual misconduct. And I want you to know, in Buddhism, there's no prohibition against queer sex, there's no prohibition against being trans, there's no prohibition about being intersex, but Buddhism isn't perfect either. However, from a modern point of view, I want you to know that casual hookups, casual sex is not sexual misconduct. Having an open relationship is not sexual misconduct. You have consent, you know about it, you're not harming anyone. B&D relationships, S&M relationships done with consent, not harming, is fine. And kinks and fetishes, all of these things are fine. They're not sexual misconduct. So sexual misconduct is especially those things which are done without others' consent and which cause harm, and usually phrased as adultery or cheating. I wanted to quickly touch on these ideas of pleasure and danger, which are mentioned in the title of this panel. And these are things that the Buddha did talk about and had quite a few opinions on. So when we think about pleasure in Buddhism, we're placing it in a very large context that the Buddha experienced. Of all the different kinds of pleasure that can be experienced in the world, he placed sensual pleasure down towards the very bottom of a spectrum of experience that humans can have. And at the other end of the spectrum, he placed the incredible bliss of meditation and the bliss of enlightenment. The Buddha was kind of not so much interested in the freedom of desire, but freedom from desire, which he thought was a much greater pleasure. It's an internal pleasure. But I want to say that sexuality, sex life, was not given a certain category of its own. It was just included in this sensual realm of experience that we can have, along with things like music, dance, food, and things like that. So it was never singled out in the same way for the lay population. However, there was some danger that the Buddha saw, some drawbacks towards sensual pleasures. And this is looking at it from a philosophical point of view, not necessarily a moral point of view. And this is to understand that sensual pleasures are temporary, that they don't last, that they are changeable, that they can become insatiable for us and can be a cause of addiction. And so the intention that we have with our sexuality and our gender and all of these sorts of things, the intention behind the way we behave, the way we act, the way we feel, these are very important. The people that we do it with, how we look, what our bodies are like, these are not so important. So this is a little bit about the kind of ethical considerations of pleasure and the ethical side of danger in Buddhism. And I just want to say a few things, because it's very short, almost 10 minutes gone. And I just want to say that there's a long history to Buddhism. It traveled all around the world and many different geographical locations, many different cultural contexts. So it did change. The attitude towards LGBTQIA people did change in certain places, and sometimes was less favorable than at other times in other places. But there's been wonderful changes, especially in the 20th century. There's the first medically assisted trans man from Europe became the first Tibetan monk, who was, the first Western person to be ordained as a Tibetan monk. The first marriage unions conducted in San Francisco in the 70s were by Buddhists. And in Australia, the cultural context for Buddhism is very progressive and very positive. There was a lot of support for same-sex marriage. And most recently, there's been a lot of coming out against religious discrimination bills at the federal and state level, because we don't want to see the real right to practice religion overshadow or eclipse the rights of us, the human rights that we have as queer, trans, and intersex people. And one last thing I want to mention, just very briefly, is that colonialism really did damage the queer and gender landscape of many parts of India and Asia. And so that's something that, when we think about Buddhist sexuality today, is something that is an overhang from that period. But this doesn't necessarily reflect the attitude towards sex and gender that the Buddha had himself. So 10 minutes already up, and I apologize for going so quickly. I hope we have some time to explore these ideas with the questions later on.
Thank you, Bhante Akaliko. There have been some questions coming in. We'll get to them at the end of all presentations. Questions about disability and about open relationships and so on. Our next speaker is Laurie Stevens. Laurie joyfully serves as a board member for the Church of the Larger Fellowship and is in Harvard University's Unitarian Universalist Ministry of Students. She's pursuing a Master's of Divinity at the school in order to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And she identifies as a queer mestiza atheistic mystic and is connecting to us from Massachusetts in the United States, where she lives.
Hello all, good evening. Where I'm at, it's very early in the morning, but it's wonderful to be here with you. As Sujith mentioned, my name is Laurie, and I'm going to go, I am so excited about this panel. And when I saw the title, I got really, really carried away and I made some slides. So I hope that's okay. I have so much I could talk about on this topic, but I'm going to dive in on one of my favorite topics, which is kink. So I hope you all will stick with me while I share my screen here. Okay, so as I just mentioned, I study spirituality, sexuality, and ethics at Harvard Divinity School. You can find me on Twitter at Mestiza Metaphor if you'd like to follow up. I want to give a quick content warning. I'll be discussing, of course, sex, but also kink, sexual assault, and violence, and have some passing mentions of things like war, suicide, racism, sexism, and religion. There's no graphic images. There's one like cartoon, sort of silly one of kink, but it's not explicit. So many of us may be familiar with things like 50 Shades of Grey in the last few years depicting kinky relationships. And, people within the kink community find a lot of pros and cons with these depictions. But overall, the really exciting thing about stuff like 50 Shades of Grey and other media depicting kink is that it's bringing it more into the public conversation. It's taking it out of the shadows from being something that's really taboo. But one thing that they don't do particularly well is just tell us what kink is. Kink is an umbrella term that includes a whole bunch of different sexual behaviors and desires, but the phrase that's used is non-normative sexual behaviors and desires. Now, that can be a lot of things because normal is very narrow in a lot of our cultures. So this is a very small list of some kinky behaviors and desires. I won't go through all of them, and I encourage you to do your own research because there's a lot of fun stuff out there, but I really want to draw your attention to the one there at the bottom, which is called BDSM. And actually Bhante mentioned it, which I am very excited about, which includes bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. This is kind of the classic kink depiction of, you know, a dominatrix in leather who ties people up and spanks them, that sort of thing. A lot of power dynamics and the use of violence in sex. But what differentiates kink from abuse is a principle often used called RAC, risk-aware and accepted consensual kink. Now, just like Bhante said earlier, that consent aspect is very, very important. This means that everyone involved, all partners, must be informed, consenting adults, and that keeps everybody safe, even if they are taking some risks and really experimenting with the range of human experiences. But this shows us that violence itself is not inherently wrong. A lot of times we'll hear people talk about the evil of violence, how violence is wrong, but it actually is the violation of consent that makes something unethical in terms of violence. A lot of people, you know, use things like sports, and those can be quite violent, but they can also be quite fun. So here I want to show you a few categories of violence to kind of elucidate the point. Over on the left, we've got cultural, structural, and direct violence. These are the typologies of violence as enumerated by Johan Galtung. But I want to add two dimensions, which are the non-consensual and consensual dimensions of violence. This is kind of what differentiates something as in that first line there, men on the street calling a woman a bitch. That is a non-consensual cultural example of violence where someone is exerting power over, is trying to make someone feel small and powerless. Whereas, you know, friends in a bar hanging out and calling each other bitch as kind of a joke can be actually an expression of cohesion, or people calling each other queer who are queer. This actually shows sort of a collective equality of power. I'm going to skip the structural level, pardon me, and go to direct there. The non-consensual direct category of violence are things we are unfortunately very familiar with, things like murder, rape, genocide, war, particularly when there are non-combatant civilian casualties. These are non-consensual direct examples of violence. But over on the right, things get really interesting where there are direct consensual examples of violence, like BDSM, as I mentioned earlier, like sports, you know, football, boxing, things like that. But there's also things like assisted suicide, where someone who is very terminally ill decides that they would like to end their life. And that is very controversial across the world still, but it's an example of exactly what Bhante mentioned earlier. When someone is consenting and they're choosing, it can be a very empowering, it can honor their agency and honor their choices for their life. So this really shows us that consent and context are crucial when it comes to violence and when it comes to using violence in sex. Now, I would never, pacifism is the philosophical choice not to exert violence upon anyone for any reason. And that makes sense for some folks, but for others, it doesn't. So self-defense, for example, though I love nonviolent resistance, and we're going to get to that in just a moment, I would never tell someone who is being sexually assaulted that they shouldn't fight back. That doesn't seem to be ethical to me. But I would also not tell someone who's engaging in violence for pleasure that they are doing something wrong because they're consenting, they're choosing that. And this shows us something really exciting when we come to civil resistance against tyranny and oppression, the difference between violent and nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent resistance in particular has fallen a little bit out of vogue in the last couple of years. People, you know, showing that Malcolm X quote about you can't do nonviolent resistance against a country that has no conscience, things like this. But actually nonviolent resistance can be extra useful against oppressive enemies, oppressive power structures, that don't recognize full humanity. It kind of does sort of a martial arts move of using their weight and their power against them. Nonviolent resistance is defined as the waging of conflict by methods of protest, non-cooperation, and intervention without physical violence. It's basically looking at any example where a group of people's consent is already being violated, where, for example, a dictator is rounding people up in internment camps, for example. And it is using nonviolence to say that's wrong. Using non-consensual violence against this group of people is wrong, and so to fight it, we're not going to use non-consensual violence. And the really exciting thing is that in a study in 2011, Erica Chenoweth and Lóre Stevens found that between 1900 and 2006, nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success as their violent counterparts. That's super exciting. Like BDSM, nonviolent resistance plays with consent and the capacity to endure suffering. It shows that I would be able to put my life on the line to protect a vulnerable person, but I would not try to kill someone else in order to do that. That doesn't fall within my ethics, my understanding of my ethics. And the good news is there's 198 methods of nonviolent resistance that have been enumerated by Gene Sharp and many others. There's tons of examples. These are just a handful, but things like slut walks, things like sex strikes, these ways of resisting oppression that also honor the other party's their capacity to consent, their agency, their life. So it's very ethical. And this shows why nonviolent is so important in so many spiritual traditions. People like the Buddha, people like Jesus of Nazareth, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and the person in the top right there you may not be as familiar with, named Simone Weil, who was a pacifist of the Christian tradition. This shows why nonviolence is such a powerful and dangerous idea. Kink shows us that ethics are on the side of consent, that we do not want to cause harm, even if we do engage in a little violence for fun. But nonviolent resistance demands that consent is respected for all involved. It says cultural oppression is wrong, but cultural oppression will not fix that problem. We have to do it in a more creative, more innovative, more ethical way. And so that's what I wanted to talk with you all about today. I would be happy to talk more. Like I mentioned, you can find me on Twitter at Misty's a Metaphor, and I study a lot of different kinds of sexuality. I'm bisexual myself, and so whether it's BDSM or another topic, I'm always happy to talk about sexual ethics and spirituality. Thank you all.
Thank you, Laurie. Next, we have Dr. Siobhan Irving. Siobhan teaches sociology and anthropology at Macquarie University in Sydney and is an executive committee member of Sydney Queer Muslims, where she serves as the nonprofit group's academic advisor. Her research interests focus on perceptions of sexuality and sexual healthcare within Muslim communities in both Singapore and Sydney.
Hello, everyone. Me and my cat, Bubby, are going to be talking to you today about love, or to be specific, I'll talk about 3 types of love: love for yourself, love for your family, and love for God. But to give some context, I'm going to first talk about homophobia and how that can impact upon this love and shape how queer Muslims think about pleasure and ethical sex. A lot of homophobia among religious communities is presented as theologically based, and Muslims are no exception to this. This means that some Muslims argue that same-sex intimacy or gender diversity is something that is against Islam. Because of this, many non-Muslims presume that there is something inherent within Islam that's homophobic. This claim has even been published in scholarly work. Some of my colleagues even think this. A lot of people accept this as a given, unfortunately. The reality is, of course, a little more complicated than that. Not only are many Muslim families accepting of their same-sex attracted and gender diverse loved ones, but Islam as a religion has an amazing capacity for pluralism because it has no centrally acknowledged religious authority. There's no single go-to source to learn what is or what is not Islamic. There's no pope, no high council. As such, Muslims follow religious figures they trust, or they may even adopt an approach commonly associated with Protestant Christianity and approach religious texts themselves and arrive at their own interpretations. Muslims are free to choose, and they come to a variety of conclusions out of that freedom. Unfortunately, some of these conclusions are quite homophobic. I refer to homophobia among Muslims instead of Islamic homophobia because I believe it's important to underscore the role of interpretation here. Like many religions, Muslim prohibitions against same-sex intimacy are usually said to originate in the primary canonical sources of the religion. For Muslims, this is first and foremost the Quran, which is considered to be the inspired word of God. And secondly, Hadith collections, which are the recordings of the sayings and deeds of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. While there is no punishment set in the Quran for same-sex intimacy, there are a number of hadith that inform homophobic attitudes towards same-sex attracted Muslims and discriminatory attitudes towards gender-diverse Muslims. If anyone's interested in learning more about these hadiths or homophobic interpretations of Islam and the challenges to them made by some Islamic religious scholars, please look at some of the work done by Dr. Scott Kugel over at Emory University in the United States. A quick Google search will reveal a wealth of literature published about this very topic. I mention these presumed theological underpinnings to Muslim homophobia because they create a lot of suffering. They get in the way of people's love for themselves, their love for others, and sometimes even their love for God. They certainly get in the way of ethical sex. Sex can't be ethical if you don't feel good about it. If you feel that you're engaging in sin or that you're dropping someone else in it by having sex, then that's not ethical. Put yourself in some hypothetical shoes for a second. Imagine you are a young Muslim person who has a deep love for God and all of creation. You see God's magnificence everywhere, in the beauty of nature, in people's kindness, in the sun's warmth on a long summer day. Yet you feel unworthy of that sun's radiance. Perhaps you were raised to believe that homosexuality was a disease, and you can't understand why no amount of praying for a cure brings you any relief. Perhaps you were raised to believe that being genderqueer is a test from God, and you're worried that you will have to choose between God's love and being yourself. Perhaps you feel you need to choose not only between God's love and being yourself, perhaps you risk losing your family's love as well. Your family might not understand that same-sex attraction or gender diversity is something that genuinely cannot be changed. Because they don't understand this, your family may see your same-sex attraction or gender diversity as just you being willfully disobedient to not only their norms, but to God as well. And perhaps to some extent, on some deep down level, you might even find yourself tending to agree with them. Because cultural conditioning, the conditioning of your family, of where you grew up, the circumstances you grew up in, that's a hard thing to shake. Maybe you think there must be something deeply wrong with you. You may try very hard to perform masculinity or femininity for your family, but you might know it's a performance. You know they expect you to enter into a heterosexual marriage and have children, perhaps, but you can't imagine that as your future. You may want with all your heart to please your parents. You love them, but you know that their expectations of you will destroy you, or you will risk destroying them with the truth. You see how this works? Muslim homophobia creates an amazing amount of suffering. And for some people, especially young people, this suffering can be very, very dangerous. It can make Muslims hate themselves when they can't pray the gay away. Homophobic attitudes can make some Muslims feel they must choose between the love of their family and God or the love of a life partner. This kind of impossible dilemma creates mental health difficulties and can sometimes even drive Muslims to self-harm or suicide. Homophobia kills all too easily. It becomes an impossible bind that interrupts people's love for themselves, it interrupts their love for each other, and it can get in the way of their love for God. And this is why Sydney Queer Muslims exists. We exist to address this bind that people can find themselves in. And we do this through fellowship and practical help, such as improving access to appropriate mental health care, as well as access to spiritual resources that can bring comfort and relief. We strongly believe that a person cannot be whole without being able to love themselves, to love each other, and to love their God. Too many young people have come to us with messages from sometimes mental health professionals, sometimes others in the queer community, who felt that their problems would all go away if they could just give up their religion. And we at Sydney Queer Muslims are here to say it doesn't have to be that way. You are perfect just as you are. And we accept everyone unquestioningly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siobhan. So at the end, we will also send you a list of resources if you're interested that has links to Sydney Queer Muslims and some other groups that are, panelists suggest as areas where you can seek support. Dr. Desmond Perry is a social worker with experience in youth work, disability and child development services, reproductive and sexual health services, HIV/AIDS support and prevention education, cancer care, and veterans and family mental health services. Since moving to Sydney in 1990, he has been a member of the Pitt Street Uniting Church, which is an open, affirming, and theologically progressive congregation, and has participated in numerous conferences and panels in sexuality in the Uniting Church. Dr. Perry additionally holds a master's degree in theology and is in a long-term relationship with his same-sex partner of 37 years, with whom he has a 19-year-old son.
Thank you. There are three aspects to this short presentation. First of all, sex and sexual pleasure are a new phenomena that Christianity has failed to appreciate and address. Secondly, the relationship between stages of moral development and the dangers of recent Christian thought on sexuality and its impact on my own journey. And thirdly, the future. Where do we go from here? Christianity and progressive thought. I want to first of all paint the context by saying that the Judeo-Christian attitudes to sex and LGBTI sexuality in particular are far from set in concrete and have gone through countless cycles over the centuries. One need only read John Boswell's 1980 book entitled Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality to see this cycling process. Secondly, sex and sexuality were pretty dire in the times of writing down of the Judeo-Christian scriptures between 900 before the Common Era and 110 in the Common Era. Women and slaves were treated as belongings to be used. Polygamy for men was common, and there was no contraception. People were living in crowded, extended family environments with no privacy. And for the heterosexually minded men, who for the most part wrote the scriptures and formulated doctrine and dogma, the concept of sexual orientation was far from their thoughts. With the exception of a few deep friendships between men and between women, stories of homoerotic sexuality are simply absent in the religious writings. A minuscule number of abusive homosexual assaults or rituals are proffered and were considered examples of the wickedness of strangers and foreigners, especially the fertility cult religions. Israelites and later the Jewish sect of the Christians thought it important that they stand apart from these pagan expressions. Thirdly, more recent but nonetheless flawed Christian concepts of sexuality, marriage, monogamy, and morality were proposed in the 19th and 20th centuries with a much stronger homophobic focus. The Victorians, and before them the Pilgrim Fathers, have a lot to answer for the spread of negative attitudes towards sex and sexuality throughout the British Empire and throughout the United States. Christian fundamentalism took these small number of negative references to homosexual sex exclusively between men and recontextualized them. They took these often 2,000 to 3,000 year old, somewhat obscure and indefinite writings and asserted that they referred definitively to inverts, Nancy boys, and to the love that dare not speak its name. That's 1892 from the poem. This is the legacy which has permeated nearly all of Christianity, West and East, Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Pentecostals. In my own life's journey as a gay Christian, my thinking and experience resonates with the stages of moral development proposed by Lawrence Kohlberg in the 1950s and 60s. Despite criticism that it is culturally and gender biased, I find it useful as a structure for understanding my developing reconciliation between my sexuality and religious faith. It also forms a basis by which I have been able to critique the flawed Christian thinking of the past, which were a danger to my sense of self, my place in the religious community, and my life enjoyment. Time does not allow an in-depth overview of the theory, but I'll leave it to you to explore whether I have done it justice in my brief summary. Stage 1 of the model says that children accept and believe the rules of authority figures without question, but may move on to consider consequences of not obeying. There is a kind of fluidity here from do or think what I tell you to do to what might happen if I don't do what you tell me to do. And the focus here, or the goal, is on reward and punishment. In stage 2, a kind of peer pressure within the community exists, where a child matures their sense of right or wrong, and they feel that it's tied to a personal and societal relationship. In other words, it's about social acceptance. Children continue to accept the rules of authority figures, but this is now because they believe that this is necessary to ensure positive relationships and the societal order, avoiding personal disapproval and acting in the common good. And the goal here is sameness. In the third stage, a person's sense of morality is based on abstract principles and values. The principal idea is flexibility. People now believe that some laws are unjust and should be changed or eliminated. The goal here is on justice, and the focus is on diversity and mutual respect for difference. As a child and adolescent, I think that I was stuck in stages 1 and 2, which led to a lot of angst, self-denial and doubt, denial of pleasure, and ultimately to remaining in the closet until my late 20s. I resent this self-rejection, which was imposed on me by religious institutions and people who were themselves stuck in an immature stage of moral development. The danger for me and other LGBTI people is that much of Christian belief and action is based on religious people being unable to move to a mature moral thinking process because they were overly focused on certainty as sacrosanct. and an ill-informed understanding of sex and sexuality. In essence, the key to reducing danger for LGBTI people in the religious community rests on the extent to which the community of faith is able to question long-held beliefs, stories, rituals, and dogma, many of which are not found or are not central to their religious scriptures, history, or tradition. Where to in the future? In the late 20th century and up until today, there has been a growing line of theological thought within Christianity, which is termed progressive. It is not an attempt to scientifically explain religious stories, a common approach in the mid-20th century called liberal theology, but a reclaiming and reimagining of the stories to apply to the 21st century world, and it probably comes out of a postmodernism. The premise is that religious stories are told and then later written in a cultural context in time and place. The challenge is to take the story and see if it applies in a new cultural context, and to decide if the story is or is not culturally appropriate in our time and place. Whether it does or does not apply is a learning moment, as it challenges our values and beliefs about meaning and application. In relation to sexuality, it is based on scientific knowledge and research, but also acknowledges the power of story and narrative. It starts on the basis of a respect of difference and of diversity, and works backwards to reclaim stories of inclusion, equality, and justice. Just as the Negro slaves in the southern USA reclaimed the stories of Moses and the slaves of Egypt as a sign of hope for emancipation and for equality, so LGBTI people emerge with their own stories of freedom, safety, and celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Such an amazing panel, and the audience seems to agree. They've got like a few questions for all of you, actually. Let's get started with a question for Bhante. So you said that people who are married are not allowed to have sex with others, and a little later you said that open relationships are accepted. Can marriages be open relationships? And another one also along the same lines. Can sexual freedoms, including casual sex or consensual fetishes, become attachments? Is there too much of a good thing in Buddhism? Is that where the harm comes in?
So I think in regards to the first question, Buddhism doesn't have a sense of marriage in the same way that it's a legal binding institution that you might find in other religions. So I think Buddhism is more of a kind of a social contract, and marriage can be defined according to the wishes of the people who are in it. And so for me, any relationship, whether married or long-term, whether short-term or casual, is governed by the same principles of non-harm and consent. So if a marriage has people who want to have an open relationship, then I can't see any problem with that personally, because it's expressed in a way that is consensual. And that's the most important thing. You have a contract with someone, and that contract is negotiated. And so within that contract, if you break the rules, then you're going to cause harm to the other person, but also harm to yourself. You're going to be cheating and lying and sneaking around, feeling guilty, feeling remorseful. So you're the first person to feel bad about this. And then, of course, when the other person finds out, then there's a lot of harm done to them and a lot of harm done to the relationship. So the avoidance of harm is key. And that's where consent comes in to that contract, whatever it may be. So that's my personal view. There may be more conservative views about marriage as an institution, and people might point to some differences between other types of relationships, but I think as far as Buddhism is concerned, it's kind of a moot point. And the second question, I think, had to do with kink and addictive behavior. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So can sexual freedoms, including casual sex and consensual fetish, become attachments? Is that too much of a good thing in Buddhism, and is that where the harm comes in?
So it's quite a complicated question. And so there is this idea of craving and attachment in Buddhism, which keeps us kind of enslaved to a perpetual cycle of suffering. Life after life, we reach out for things that we want, we grasp on, and we can't let go. We become fixated and stuck. And this suffering that occurs is what keeps us spiraling through what's called samsara, this cycle of suffering, life after life. And so all attachments and all craving on the Buddhist path eventually needs to be let go of. But there is no imperative for how this happens or when this happens. There's no sense of commandments in Buddhism. It's a personal journey. It's a journey that happens in its own time, in its own way, that can't be forced, that can't be mandated. So what's a difficult thing for one person may not be for another person. So something that is a big impediment, a big snare, the Buddha called it, is something that might be chocolate cake for one person, and for another person could be a rampant sexuality. But these things are not fixed, they're not certain, and they change over time, and they change in regards to causes and conditions. So if you have a normal, healthy sex life is something that doesn't bring you harm, doesn't cause others harm, and brings you happiness and good feelings. But if that should somehow change and become problematic in some way, where you're looking for opportunities to hurt people, where you're only interested in your own personal enjoyment, you're not interested in the needs of the other party, or where the sexuality becomes problematic, where it's veering towards something that maybe is illegal or that is addictive and is taking over your life in a way that is beyond your control, then that's when perhaps we can say that the pleasure has become suffering. And so that's something that we need to understand in our own minds for ourselves. And it's something that can't easily be judged from outside.
Thank you. The next question is directed to Siobhan, but anyone else is welcome to respond. Is it okay to have sex as a disabled person? Just clarifying, what is ethical sex when it concerns a disabled person?
I think the same principles that we've been speaking about all night apply here. A disabled person is a person with desires and the ability to experience pleasures just like anybody else. So if a person consents, there's sex can be ethical, sex can be joyful, regardless of the ability or limits of your body. And also disability can be more than physical. Like I answered that question on the assumption that we're talking about physical disability. Disabilities can also be emotional, they can be mental, they can be cognitive. And so that's a very, very broad question. We would have to, I wish we had more time to really tease out the nuances of all the different levels that this question could occupy. But I think in short, where there's consent and where there's a will for pleasure, then yes, of course, sex can be ethical.
Thank you. Des, do you want to chime in on that?
I just agree 100%. It's absolutely obvious that disabled people are people. So, of course, they're sexual beings and they have the right to engage in intimacy just as anybody else does.
Laurie, this next question is for you. You mentioned that violence is not the problem, but non-consensual violence is, but where's the line drawn? I heard about a bizarre true story involving someone who actually sought to be murdered after it was advertised online. Just because it's based on consent, does it make it right?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this topic, is because it really pushes the edge of the human sexuality ethics. Someone mentioned, I think it might have been the same person, mentioned negotiation in the comments. And that is a key part of kinky sex, and really any ethical sex, is communication between all parties involved, with expectations, limitations, safe words. And because the negotiation stage is baked into an ethical kink experience, it often is actually safer than vanilla sex, because everyone is taking that into account as part of the process, where sometimes vanilla sex can be very, you see it in movies where people just slam each other into doors and they're making out and nobody's talking to each other about, what do you want? What do you like? What don't you like? Where should I stop? How do we know when we need to take a time out? And another phase is something called aftercare, which is very, very important to kink. A lot of kinky experiences are very intense. They can be physically painful, they can be emotionally painful. And it's so important to take care of all parties afterwards to make sure everyone is back on a safe level. So these kinds of caretaking responsibilities before, after, and during the sexual experience is kind of how we mitigate, we lower risk as much as possible, and everyone involved can accept the risk ahead of time, as long as they are informed, consenting adults.
Thank you. We've only got time for another last question or last two questions. So the next one is, so this person's been following global news for a while and has noticed a rise in discourse surrounding paraphilias and paraphilic disorders such as pedophilia, with far-right groups gaining attention, the more recent victims of child sex abuse in Catholic Church coming forward. How can we understand these paraphilias in relation to religion and spirituality in today's society where child abuse and child marriage is still too common? Des, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure. Look, I think that pretty much all of us have touched on this issue of consent. And I think we are kind of agreed, and please disagree with me, but I think we are agreed that consent is a primary issue in consideration of ethical sexual expression. And I think the difficulties with pedophilia and other abusive forms of sexual expression is that it denies that is required, and that we are abusive of the other person, we are disrespectful of them. It is not a mutually satisfying and satisfactory arrangement. And so I think in that sense, it is unethical. Just basically, it's unethical to engage in any kind of sexual expression where one person is not consenting.
And the final question for all of you: in what ways has your experience of being queer been embodied in your own spiritual practices? So let's maybe start with Bhante, and then go to Siobhan, Des, and Laurie.
So a few people have touched on this idea. I think Siobhan especially talked about how impossible it is to separate your spiritual life from your sexuality or gender identity. And for me, as a queer Buddhist, it wasn't actually until I kind of got in robes when I ordained as a monk that I understood the bubble world that I had been living in before. And there is still lingering homophobia, transphobia, interphobia in broad sections of the community. And even well-meaning people can be incredibly homophobic. And this is something that I think religious people, spiritual people, don't see in themselves, because they think of themselves as being a good person, as being a religious person somehow gives you some sort of ethical or angelic superiority, which is simply not true. And so when I became a monk, I rediscovered, I suppose, layers of homophobia, layers of transphobia in communities that I wasn't previously engaging in. And so I understood that I had some work to do for my own community to do some upskilling and to raise some awareness there. And especially with the ongoing debate, the public discourse around religion and sexuality and gender, I felt that I had to do something for those people in my community who were gender diverse and had different sexualities, so that they could feel like they belong and that they were cared for and accepted. They shouldn't have to make this decision between their spirituality and their sexuality. So this is a large part of my work as a Buddhist monk. It's not all my work. It's in some ways a small part of my work, but it does take up a lot of my time. And I hope that it is of some benefit to my community. It certainly has been of benefit to myself. And in this process, I've been very fortunate to connect with a lot of other queer faith groups. And that's been very rewarding for me. And I think together we can make a real shift, a real change in our community.
I'm not, wow, it's a hard question to answer. I think I started really reflecting on this when I was living in Singapore. So I only moved to Australia in 2012. And before that, I spent many years living in Singapore. And Singapore is a very interesting place to reflect on sexuality, sexual attraction, and religion. I won't speak too much about it because our time is limited, but in any case, I used to visit this place called the Karamat, and it's said to be the resting place of Sultan Iskandar Shah. And it's a really, really pretty place. It's people go there to leave flowers, and there's an understanding that if you visit places like this, you can benefit from something called baraka, which is, I guess, like a kind of healing energy, this sort of beneficial presence. And I used to like to sit there, chat to people who were also there. I've been an anthropologist for many years. I was an anthropologist before I even knew I was an anthropologist. I just always loved speaking to strangers. And I was at that time, I was having a hard time back then. I was way back when. I was a heterosexually married woman, not particularly happy, and exploring all these things in my head and my heart. And I remember I spoke to this elderly Malay man, a Muslim, and we were talking about religion. And he was someone that I would have expected to have a completely opposite viewpoint on life and just about everything to me, a 20-something young woman who is very, very liberal. Liberal meaning left-leaning. And it turned out we were more similar than I could have imagined. He told me I was trying to fight him. I had a lot of conflictual energy and I wanted to fight him. And I was challenging about, but the Quran says this and the Quran says that. And, you know, this is very, there's things in Islam that need to be challenged, blah, blah, blah. Very, very kind of conflictual energy about me. And he said to me, look, the Quran is like a mirror. If you approach the Quran with a hard heart, with an unmerciful heart, with rigidity, with that ugly mindset, then it's going to reflect you back to you. If you approach it with an open heart, with mercy, almost every single surah in the Quran begins with, in the name of God, most merciful, most kind. If you approach the Quran with that same mercy, you'll see that reflected back to you. And holy shit, that changed my life. That man changed my life. And I've been carrying that ever since. And I've been spreading that message to absolutely anyone who will listen, who, dear people, tonight includes you. But I'll shut up now and pass the mic along.
Des, it's your turn.
Thanks. Yes, look, I think that being different is a gift, and I think being queer is a gift. And I think it's a gift in a spiritual sense, because my queerness made me question not just spirituality, but my social connectedness, my family relationships, my direction in life. You know, a whole lot of things were questioned because I was different. And I look at my siblings. I've got 2 sisters and a brother, and they're all straight, and they haven't had the same amount of questioning in how they live their lives, including how they relate to God, how they relate to the church, or, you know, any religion really. I've got one atheist brother, one Pentecostal sister, and one Catholic sister, but they've all kind of just drifted into their religious rituals and so forth without really having to question the central aspect of who am I, and am I cared for, am I loved? And the assumption, I think too many people take it for granted if they are not challenged about themselves being somehow different from others. So I think queerness is a wonderful gift.
Laurie?
As Sujith mentioned at the beginning, I identify as an atheist mystic. And so for me, that means I understand myself to be physically connected. My very particles, the molecules of my being, have been so many other forms before me and will continue after me. And so sexuality and being queer connects me to that. I think sex itself can be a spiritual practice, because it connects you to others, it connects you to yourself, it connects you to like the amazing existence of a body that can feel pleasure. Like, incredible. So thank you all for your wonderful questions. I hope that helps.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. There's been a lot of conversation happening in the chat box, which is quite heartening to see. Lots of really important things about consent as well. So thank you, Bhante Akaliko, Siobhan, Laurie and Des, and everyone else who came. We would highly appreciate it if you could complete the post-event survey, and remember that support is always available, even as much of everyday life has moved online, and there are resources. Just feel free to ask any of us, we'll be happy to share. Check out the other SEXtember events and get an STI test as part of keeping yourself and others healthy. If you are a UNSW affiliate, testing is available through telehealth and on campus at the Hump Day events every Wednesday of SEXtember, 16th and 16th and 23rd September, sorry. Take care and be safe, everyone. Remember, you're beautiful, extraordinary, and worthy. Good night.